In this video, I will show you how you can bring not only your source code for your .NET plugins and HTML and JavaScript web resources, but also your point and click configurations into Visual Studio to enable using source control for all aspects of your Common Data Service or Dynamics 365 application. As of the Spring 2018 release, the core platform in Dynamics 365, often referred to as XRM by those who've been using it, has now been made available as the Common Data Service. And so whether you're watching this video to learn about Dynamics 365 or the Common Data Service, the core platform is one and the same. And so this video should apply equally regardless of which terminology you're familiar with. All right, so to get started, I've previously published a blog post that explains how to use a tool in the SDK called Solution Packager to do some of what I'll be showing you today. Now, this blog post is over 6 years old, and while all the core concepts in the video still apply, there are more productive ways of doing what I showed you how to do in the video. And in the case of this video, I'm going to show you how to use a community tool called spkl Task Runner inside of Visual Studio to automate a lot of the things that I did manually in this previous video. But very similar to the previous video, this is all built on top of guidance that's in the Dynamics 365 SDK documentation. Depending on when you watch this video, this documentation may have already been rebranded as the Common Data Service documentation, because again, the Common Data Service as of spring 2018 is the core platform that Dynamics 365 runs on top of. And so in this documentation, you'll see reference to a tool called Solution Packager. And this is the tool that the spkl Task Runner will automate. You can certainly use this tool by yourself at the command line, but I think you'll quickly see how the spkl Task Runner makes the daily mechanics of using this tool much more productive. And while I'm showing you the mechanics of getting this all up and running from scratch, you certainly are going to want to understand some of the proven practices around using source control with your solution files. There's also documented in the SDK, or what's now called the developer guide. And one more thing, so if you're interested in learning more about the spkl Task Runner, if you go to GitHub, Scott Durow, Sparkle XRM, there is a wiki here, and you click on spkl, and it gives you some decent documentation about some of the things you'll see in this video today. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this documentation in great detail. That's a follow-up exercise for the viewer. But what I am going to do is show you how to get started from Visual Studio. So I've done a couple things just to get started. So I've created a solution, an empty solution in Visual Studio, just so you don't have to see me doing all that. And then I have also created an empty solution in a common data service instance or environment. Those are two words that you'll probably hear interchangeably. Before the spring release, these were called instances when this platform was part of Dynamics 365. Moving forward, you'll hear the term environment used in conjunction with the common data service terminology. But as you can see, I've got an empty solution, it's got no components in it, and I've already used an existing publisher, right? I'm assuming that you know some basic things about Dynamics 365 solution packaging or common data service solution packaging, again, depending on which technology you're coming at this video from. But again, these are the same things. If I make reference to Dynamics 365 or XRM or instance, I'm talking about the old terminology, and I apologize in advance if I use old terminology. But if you hear me say common data service, environment, etc., that's the new terminology with the new PowerApp's common data service branding. All right, so as I mentioned, there's nothing in this solution package yet, so let's start building something out. So the first thing we want to do is go back to Visual Studio, and I will open this in File Explorer. I'm just going to create a new folder here called Solution Package, because what I want to do is get the basic metadata of this solution package inside of Visual Studio so I can put it into source control. So we've just created that directory, and I will say add existing website. The reason I choose a website is because it's a nice project type in Visual Studio that allows you to point to a folder and see everything within that folder. So you don't have any of some of the artifacts of other project types in Visual Studio where they hide things. You can certainly use other project types. This is just my preference. So I will find my SC demo folder and then that solution package directory and click open. All right, so now I can come in here, I can right click and select manage NuGet packages. As I said, we're going to install the spkl task runner. It's a simple and lightweight deployment task runner for Dynamics 365. Basically, this is a command line tool that will pull in a bunch of Common Data Service or Dynamics 365 SDK tools and wrap some syntactic sugar around them to make the day in, day out usage of them much easier. So I'll go ahead and install this, accept. Notice that it uses the Microsoft.crm SDK.core tools. I'll click accept here. Notice that it offers an update. We want to take that update because we want the latest version of the core tools. Right now, this is 8.2. My Common Data Service environment or Dynamics 365 instance is using 9.0. And so we want to make sure that we have the latest tools. So I'll click update there and accept. Now, as you see me build out this demonstration, you'll recognize that this Sparkle task runner has all sorts of capability, not just solution packaging, but deploying web resources, deploying plugins, etc. So what I like to do, since this project is only for solution packaging, I don't need some of the stuff that it brought in, so I'm going to delete app_code. Notice that everything in bin core tools is the set of Dynamics 365 and or common data service utilities and assemblies that were brought in. Notice that there's that solution packager tool, and notice that this is all ignored for source control. So it's already been added to the git ignore. I'm using git in my case. And then I like to come in here and do this. I like to ignore this folder because there's all sorts of log files that get put in that folder, et cetera. And obviously we don't want to check those into source control. And then come back and delete the things I'm not going to use. So this project is only for solution packages. So we're going to take all these things and delete them. And then these two, I want to go ahead and add those back into source control because I want to share this bat file with other people on the team so they don't have to have their own local copy of the bat file. And I'm going to do one more thing, and this will make a little bit more sense down the road, but I'm going to do it now. I'm going to copy this and paste. I'm going to rename this to pack.bat, and then I'm going to go into the file and rename this from import to pack. So pack.bat, change import to pack. Now might be a good time to pause and review, rewind, make sure that you've done all the things that I've done so far. As you can see, these are just batch files that use this sparkle.exe, which was downloaded as part of the NuGet package, which then uses a bunch of assemblies and executables from the Dynamics 365 / Common Data Service SDK assemblies. All right, so again, what we're trying to do is get this initial metadata about this solution package into source control, and then build some things out and check those into source control or commit those to source control so that we have this history of changes over time. Because of course, source control is the industry proven way of being able to know what's changed in your application as people make changes over time. So to do that, we have to come into our Sparkle JSON file and edit some things. In this case, we're not using web resources or plugins or early bound types. We're just using solutions, so we'll delete that. So keep this clean, and we'll save. Now my solution itself is called SC demo. So we're going to want to take the unique name and put it there. We're going to want to take this and put it there as well. And this basically will tell the task runner to look into this solution on the server and pull down what's in that solution onto the disk. And vice versa, when we go to recompose that solution, right, take it from the source controllable items and quote unquote build it back into a deployable zip file, it'll call it this using a versioning format. And the rest of these will change over time. So now I can come over here and I can right click unpack.bat, select execute file. We can just get a little command line tool. Of course, if you prefer to keep the command line window open all the time, or if you've installed things like whack terminal, if I open this up, it just gives me an embedded terminal window in Visual Studio. However you choose to do it is up to you, but of course you could come in here and you could change directory to solution package, spkl, right? And then you could run unpack from here. In fact, let's just do this now. And so I'm going to create a new one. So here, this is just the set of connections you can connect to from the tool. So I'm going to create a new connection. I'm going to hit enter for the CRM server name and port, and then Y for it being in Microsoft Office 365. I'll log in. Provide my username and password. Then it's going to ask me which instance or environment in the newer terminology do I want to use. And mine is called marksc-sc demo. So I'll hit number 2 here and hit enter. Now it's going to connect to that environment or instance. It's going to read all the metadata in the solution and pull it down locally so I can check that metadata into source control. But if I come over and refresh, notice we have a package directory. The reason we have a package directory is because that's what the configuration file said to do. Put the package, the contents of the package in this path. If I open this, we have an other solution relationships customizations, right? This is the core empty solution package and its metadata. So we've just downloaded the point and click configuration that I did to create the solution into source control, right? And in fact, I can come in here now and I can right click this, and let's add that to source control as well. And I can right click this and say execute file. And what this will do is that it'll take these smaller files, which are not in the deployable form, they're source code, and it'll package them up. Now, you don't actually need to connect to package, but the tool still asks you to connect, but it's not actually going to connect to the server. In this case, it's actually going to look at those files, and it's going to recompose this zip file. And so if I look at this now, notice that there's a zip file. And again, we don't want to check in the zip file, which is the deployable asset, right? It's the thing that gets built. So we're going to ignore that. Go back over here. Let's just open it up. And you'll notice that the formats are different. This is actually what you can import into Dynamics 365, this zip file right here, which is slightly different than the source code over here. And as this demo progresses, you'll see the differences as we go. So we'll just come over here and we'll commit the changes and we'll just call this initial solution metadata. Oops, initial solution metadata. All right, so I'm just committing locally. You could obviously push this to your remote Git repository, but we'll just work local here. Okay, so now let's do something to get more into source control in terms of point and click configurations. So let's take this and let's create a new entity, and let's just call it samples. Let's take all the settings off because that's just how I like to do it. And then we'll save and close this. So again, it's creating the entity in my development environment or my development instance. If you're familiar with Dynamics 365 terminology, let's make sure this is published. Now I want to bring those changes. I just did some point and click configuration, but I want those changes to be tracked into source control, right? So let's do that. Let's unpack again. Connect to that same development instance, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to connect. It's going to look at what's in the solution package and bring everything down locally and overwrite files that have changed. So let's go ahead and look at those changed files. And if I come up here and we refresh, we'll see that we've got a bunch of new files. We've got a folder called entities now. That's our entity. We've got its entity definition. These are all new files. But we also see that the solution file and the relationships file has changed. So if I, for example, look at this view and I double click on solution, now we can start to see the value here, that we can see the changes over time because all those point and click configurations are brought into source control as XML files that we can see changes over time. All right, so let's commit that and we can just say added sample.dkdt underscore sample entity. So now we've shown some basic point and click configuration that's brought into source control so we can have that granular tracking of what's changing over time. Let's add a web resource. So if we go back to here, I'm just going to create another folder called web resources. And then very similarly, I'm going to come in, add existing website. I'll select that web resources folder. And again, in this case, this really wasn't a website. It was just a container for my solution packages. In this case, it's actually kind of like a website. It's not a true, ASP.NET website, but our web resources will go in this. And so we can use all the Visual Studio tooling for HTML and JavaScript editing, etc. All right, so similarly, we need to manage NuGet packages, install Sparkle, accept, update Sparkle to the latest, or Microsoft CRM SDK.core tools to the latest, accept. Then very similarly, this is for web resources, so we don't need the .NET boilerplate code. We'll get to that later, so we'll delete that. We will comment this out. I'm sorry, let's go over here and let's ignore these local items. Then I'll come back over to Solution Explorer. So this is web resources, so we don't need plugins, we don't need workflows, early bound, we don't need pack and import, so we can delete all those. And then I'll select these two and I'll add those back to source control. And then I'll come in here and I'll just add an HTML file. I'll just call this sample.html. All right, so I want to be able to deploy this to my solution package. And then I want to get any metadata about that web resource over here in source control as well. So first let's deploy it. this case, we're using web resources, but we're not using this other stuff, so I'm going to just go clean up. All right, we've got to do a few things here. We need the solution name, so let's go to the other Sparkle JSON file. Let's grab the solution name. And if I wanted to, I could create a subfolder in here and put my web resources in there. Different people have their preferences. I like to take this and just make it empty, and I'll show you why. Because from the root of web resources, I want a file called sample.html in sparkle.json. So to do that on the server, right, in the Dynamics environment, or sorry, in the Common Data Service environment or the Dynamics instance, I want this to be dkdt sample.html. And if you look in the SDK, it kind of makes some general recommendations about how you structure unique names of web resources, but ultimately that's going to map to sample.html down here. All right, so in summary, what we've said is for the local file, sample.html, deploy it with the name dkdt_/sample.html to this solution. All right, so if I save this, right click, deploy web resources, click execute file, and we hit 9 again for the same connection. It's going to go through, it's going to find that web resource, and it's going to deploy it to my solution. And in fact, if we go over to my solution in the browser, we will now see that it has done just that. So if we go back to Visual Studio, now what we want to do is pull the metadata about that into the solution package for source control. So to kind of explain this a little bit, we've just deployed a file locally to our solution up on the server or in the service. But when we do that, it creates a bunch of additional metadata. So if you were to, for example, export this solution and open it up, there'd be metadata in that solution package about this file right here. And that's what we need to get into source control up here. So to do that, we'll go to our sparkle.json file. And what's going to happen is when we call unpack, it'll pull that metadata down. It'll put it into a folder called web resources in this structure over here. And then since we already have that HTML file in source control, we only want the metadata. We don't want a duplicate copy of the actual HTML file because we have it over here. What we want to be able to do is then right click this and pack it such that the tool will read all this metadata, bring it back into that deployable form, and pull the HTML file from over here into that zip file package. So to do that, I'm going to delete these. And this will make a little bit more sense when I call unpack and then show you calling pack. But now if I save this and I right click unpack, and again we hit 9 for the same connection, it'll pull down that additional metadata that was created up on the server or in the service. I have a bad habit of saying server, but I think you get the point. All right, so I can close this and we can take a look at what it brought back down. So refresh. Notice now that there is a web resources folder, just like I mentioned over here. There's a web resources folder, that's the from. And then in there, there's an XML file, right? But notice there is no HTML file. This is just the metadata about the HTML file. And the map file, or the map directive in the sparkle.json, is going to tell the underlying solution packager tool that when we call pack.bat and it goes to look for this HTML file, pull it in from over here. So let's do that. If I right click this, select execute file, hit 9, and it's been packed. So I can come over here, I can open this file locally on disk, I can see there's now a web resources directory and the actual format of a deployable solution package. So again, here it's in its deployable form, here it's in its source code form. And as you build this out, what you'll notice is that a lot of stuff gets jammed into this solution XML file. And that's what makes these not source control friendly in their raw form, which is why we use first the solution packager tool, right? The tool that was downloaded right here. And then second, the spkl tool, the task runner here, that does the work of decomposing and recomposing as necessary so we can get that granular level of control and source control. So we can look at what's changed. So the solution has changed again, and this time we can see basically what's changed is that we've added that web resource. And in this file, we can see what's changed. Again, we see those changes over time. There's now a web resources section. So I can commit all this to it and say added web resources. Commit staged. Now again, that pack command will create the zip file. And you could take this zip file and you could pull it into a test environment to validate that the import succeeds. And if that's sort of where you are in your DevOps application lifecycle management process, great. One of the things I will show in a subsequent video is how you can use something like Visual Studio Team Services or Team Foundation Server once you've checked this into your remote or pushed this to your remote repository to actually build this on a build server every time your code is brought into, for example, master. All right, so we've done point and click configurations, we've showed web resources. Once you've got the basic pattern, you can point and click your way to more and more in source control. You can add more and more web resources, deploy them, test them out, and then once they're ready, commit those to source control, etc. So what about plugin assemblies? That's really kind of the last thing I want to show. So we'll come in here and we'll add a new project and we'll just call this my plugins. And then similarly, we need to add the task runner. So we'll come in here, manage NuGet packages. First, we'll add spkl. Because just like I did with web resources, I'm going to use spkl to help me deploy my .NET plugin code to my dev environment. So I'll click OK here. And then we'll also type CRM SDK. And I want Microsoft.crmsdk.core assemblies. And again, because what's now called the Common Data Service came from what used to be called Dynamics CRM, which eventually became Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, and now is called the Common Data Service as a separate platform. We still have some of the legacy naming, and so core assemblies are still the .NET DLL names from the old CRM naming days. Perhaps sometime in the future this might change, but for now, if it kind of confuses you, the effectively what used to be called the CRM SDK that became the Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement SDK is now the Common Data Service SDK. So let's install that. Let's make sure we have the latest update for the core tools as well. We'll accept that. And then very similar, like as I did over here and here for this spkl tool, I'm going to do a few things. One, I'm worried about plugins here, not web resources or packing and unpacking. So let's just go ahead and delete that. From a source control perspective, let's ignore the folder, but then let's go back to Solution Explorer and then add these back. So these are all plugin and workflow related. So we'll go ahead and add to source control again, because again, I want to share these with my teammates in the event that I make changes to them, tweak them to my local development environment. One of the things that I didn't mention and I didn't show is that I showed you how to deploy web resources. I showed you how to use deploy web resources.bat. There's also a download web resources.bat that will allow you to point to an existing set of web resources, download them from the solution package into this Visual Studio project, and provide all the Sparkle.json configuration necessary. Kind of saves you time. So if you didn't start off using Sparkle, but you want to start using it, you can kind of do what I just did and then download the web resources so you don't have to manually do what I just did. But if you're starting from scratch, obviously the approach I just showed you is the way to go. And then similarly, I'm going to show you how to deploy a plugin using the Sparkle Task Runner, as well as get the deployment of the plugin metadata into the solution package. There's also an option, and this is a activity for the viewer, to take existing instrumented plugin code and have it applied. Now, this will make a little bit more sense when I show you how to use Sparkle to deploy a plugin. So if I rename this, we'll just call this, I got to rename it. We'll call this sample pre-create. Now notice this little attribute class. This is a helper that Sparkle downloads, and you'll see me using this in just a second. Now, of course, you can come in here and you can implement iPlugin, and you can use the plugin registration tool to deploy this. And nothing's changed there. If you're not familiar with the plugin registration tool, you can go research in the developer guide on how to use it to deploy plugins. What I'm going to show you is the way I like to do it using the spkl task runner. So we'll just call this do nothing, right? Because this isn't about how to build plugins as much as it is about showing you how to get them into source control and integrated with the solution package source control. Let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit. Now, of course, to get this to build and deploy, we need to give it a strong name. Get an advanced topic for plugin development. I'm focusing more on source control here. So if you're not familiar with signing and why you need to sign an assembly before you can deploy it, I suggest you go take a look at the documentation, but we'll just call this temp.snk. Don't worry about a password. Make sure this thing builds. All right, the build succeeded. So now let's go back into our plugin, and we want this to execute. And this is where this Sparkle CRM plugin registration attribute comes in handy. So I don't want to do it on the class. I want to do it, I'm sorry, I don't want to do it on the method. I want to do it on the class. So we'll call that. And basically what we're doing is in code, we're saying how we want this plugin to be registered. Again, just for emphasis, you can do this with the plugin registration tool. This is just syntactic sugar and automation, so you don't have to leave Visual Studio to do this stuff. And so we'll call this message enum, and we want create. Get rid of that. So the message we want this plugin to execute on is create. The entity logical name is dkdt underscore sample. The stage is pre-operation. The execution mode is synchronous, right? These are all things that you would do with the plugin registration tool. I just find it really nice to be able to see this in your code and express it in your code, not a requirement. No filtering attributes. We will give it a name, so we'll call this dkdt underscore sample pre-create, and then we'll give it an execution order of 1, and then an isolation mode of sandbox, and that's all we need. That's the minimum we need to use the Sparkle task runner. One more thing we need to do here is clean this up because we're just focused on plugins right now. So let's delete that. And let's delete the rest of it. Early bound types is another cool feature of this spkl task runner, but we're not going to focus on that for this video. And the next thing we need to do, just like we've been doing previously, or like we did for the web resources, we need to make sure that we tell the tool which solution to deploy to, right? So basically we're saying over here, because we're now in this sparkle.json, we're saying deploy plugins to this solution. Build this again just for good measure. Succeeded. So now I can right click, deploy plugin, execute file, hit my same connection. And so from Visual Studio, I deploy to my development instance or development environment. It's up there in the service, that deployed. So let's go ahead and validate that. If I refresh this, we'll see that that's in there. Now, just like when we deployed the web resource, we deployed a file, but then there's solution metadata associated with that deployment. So here we deployed the plugin and the SDK message, right? The SDK message was defined using this attribute. Again, you can do it with the plugin registration tool, but in my case, I just find this very productive and convenient. And so we need to get what's in here, the metadata part of what's in here, over here. So similar to what we've been doing, we call unpack.bat, execute the file, and it's going to go ahead and pull down that metadata. All right, now if we look at the changes here, we can see that it modified customizations in solution again, and it added some metadata for the SDK messages. And I probably should have checked things in or committed my changes before I did this, but you get the point. I'll come over here and we can test out that we can refresh the solution package. There is the information for the plugin assemblies. All right, so in order for pack.bat to work, we have to go back into our Sparkle JSON file, because now when we pack, not only do we want to pull the HTML from this project into the zip file that gets created, we want to pull the .NET DLL that gets built into the zip file that gets created. So to do that, we have to come back over here, and very similarly, we want to find the plugin assemblies, right, that are here. So from plugin assemblies, we want to map that to a folder on disk, and that folder is going to be called My Plugins, right? The name of this project. So if I rename that just to get the text, copy it, and paste it here. One thing to bear in mind, and I'll just do a sanity check here, if you haven't updated the NuGet packages, you may get some issues. And the reason for that is that some of the formats of these packed and unpacked files has changed in different versions of Dynamics. So depending on which version of the tools you're using, you need to make sure that the version, if you've got the latest version of Dynamics for the Common Data Service, i.e. V9, that you're using the latest tools. But we've mapped my plugins. So again, we were saying when we pack, take what's in plugin assemblies, recompose it into a proper solution file with the DLL that's coming from the bin directory that is built from this project over here. So assuming I've done everything right, we can come over here and execute pack. And again, this doesn't actually connect, it just works locally, but that just packed. So now we can close this up and we can look at the zip file. And again, what we're doing with this pack.bat is kind of mimicking in this process what might be done on a build server, right? We just haven't introduced the build server yet, but you'll see that we've got plugin assemblies. There they are. We've got SDK messages. If you actually look inside of the solution and the customizations, you'll see those SDK messages, etc. But again, in source control, we've got granular information that we can see what has changed over time. So again, for here, we can say compare with unmodified, and we can see for this commit, I've added the HTML as well as the DLL and the SDK message, right? That's that, that, and that. So we can commit these or changes. Or changes, probably a bad commit message, so practice a little bit more discipline when you're making changes, but you kind of get the point here. So now if you look at what we have all of the point and click configuration metadata in source control, and we can look at the history over time as things get added and changed. We have HTML web resources and .NET plugin DLLs. So everything that makes up this solution package right here, all in source control. And then we have the benefit of being able to see what changes were made when over time. Of course, if we push this to a remote repository, GitHub or Visual Studio Team Services, etc., we would have it in a central location that others could take a look at. In a follow-on video, I'll add to this project and show you how you can add things like sample data and deployment automation with a tool called Package Deployer to take this to the next level. For now, I hope this was a helpful primer to go from zero to source control of your entire application.